In the heart of Auschwitz, blocks of brick and concrete stood as mute witnesses of barbarism. There, in that space where life was extinguished in its most atrocious forms, each block had its own role in the machinery of death, from the deception of false promises to the cold efficiency of extermination. Numbered blocks, grey and gloomy, became the final resting place for countless souls who were stripped of their humanity before being taken into the abyss. Block 4, for example, was a simple brick and concrete building designed to resemble any other facility in the camp. Behind its common facade, however, was one of the complex's first gas chambers, a windowless space in the basement intended for the methodical elimination of those the Nazis considered inferior. The victims, mostly Jews, were taken to this place under the pretext of taking a shower. Once inside, the fake showers on the ceiling released Zyklon B. In a matter of minutes, the lives of those who were there ended by asphyxiation. The architecture of the block was designed with deception. It was not simply a gas chamber. It was a trap carefully orchestrated to keep the victims in a state of calm, leading them to their deaths without resistance. The gas was released, and at that moment, the truth of their situation became apparent, but it was too late. The inert bodies were quickly transferred to the adjacent crematorium to be cremated, erasing any trace of their existence. Not even eternal rest was allowed. The ashes were scattered as if they had never existed. Block 7, on the other hand, featured a more insidious form of horror. It was known as the Building of the Sick or Infirmary, but that name was a cruel mockery. In reality, this block was nothing more than a rallying point for those who could no longer work and were destined to die. The prisoners who were sent there knew it. There was no illusion that they would receive medical treatment. It was a slow wait, a premonition of death that dragged on over time. The head of the administration, Rudolf Verba, a Jewish prisoner, described the macabre routine. Twice a week, a camp doctor selected useless prisoners, those too weak or sick to work. They were loaded onto trucks and transported to the nearby birch forest, where a large barracks converted into a gas chamber awaited them. Those who survived Block 7 did so with the certainty that their turn would come sooner or later. Another was Block 21. It was intended to be a place of healing, but it was a grotesque illusion. It was the camp's operating room, where the imprisoned doctors tried under inhumane conditions to save lives. But the reality was much darker. Medical supplies were scarce, conditions unsanitary, and fear of selection for extermination hung over all who entered. More than 11,000 surgeries were performed in that place, but most did not have a happy ending. Operations were supervised by SS doctors, whose presence ensured that efficiency took precedence over the well-being of patients. Instead of being a place of hope, this block became a space where prisoners were treated as mere objects in a system that sought their destruction. Hopelessness and psychological terror marked all who walked through their doors, knowing that at any moment they could be selected for death. In contrast, Block 24 had a completely different purpose. This block was a warehouse, a place where the belongings confiscated from prisoners when they arrived at the camp were kept. Clothes, shoes, photos, and personal belongings were piled up in disorder, without any respect for their origin. This act of dispossession was not simply theft, it was a crucial part of the process of dehumanization. By taking away their possessions, the Nazis also took away their identity, turning them into numbers, into beings without a past or future. The objects stored there were sorted and sent to Germany to be reused, but what was left there, what was not useful, was accumulated in mountains of forgotten memories, silent proof of the annihilation of thousands of lives. The SS who ran this warehouse made sure that everything was used for the benefit of the Reich, no matter the origin or the history behind each piece. Finally, Block 25, known as the Death Block, was where female prisoners waited before being executed in the gas chambers. This block was the last step before death. Women selected to die were taken there and left for days, sometimes weeks, without food or water, only for their inevitable end to come. This block offered no way out, no hope. The walls of the building had witnessed the last moments of tens of thousands of women, their cries of despair, their cry for their lost children, echoed through the air, charging the place with unfathomable sadness. Compared to the other blocks, the 25 was a symbol of the purest despair. If Block 4 deceived its victims with the promise of a shower, it did not even offer that false comfort. But none of these blocks were the most famous in the concentration camp. The most famous were Block 10 and Block 11. Doctors from Hell, the inhuman experiments of Block 10. In a shady corner of Auschwitz, there was a place where sunlight never penetrated. This place was Block 10, a brick building that stood in a harmless appearance, but whose interior housed some of the most abominable crimes against humanity. The names of the executioners who operated in Block 10 resonate in the annals of history as synonymous with cruelty and contempt for life. Karl Klauberg, a gynecologist whose obsession with sterilization led him to inject caustic substances into the bodies of Jewish women. The latter, who had been torn from their homes and their lives, were turned into subjects of experimentation under the pretext of science. Klauberg did not stop to consider the pain his procedures inflicted. Their goal was to obstruct the fallopian tubes, regardless of the fact that this meant a slow and painful death for many of them. But Block 10 was not limited to a single form of torture. Horst Schumann carried out sterilization experiments using X-rays. These rays, invisible to the naked eye, burned the flesh from within, leaving scars that not even death could erase. Schumann had no qualms about surgically removing the affected organs, as if the women and men he subjected were little more than laboratory animals. Mutilation became a daily routine, just another part of the functioning of that terrible place. Edward Wirths, for his part, devoted himself within the walls of Block 10 to the amputation of women's cervixes, photographing their bodies as if they were mere objects for study. The sound of scissors cutting meat mingled with the muffled screams of those who knew their lives were about to end. And while women were cut and poisoned, Bruno Weber engaged in another kind of atrocity. For him, blood became a macabre playground. He injected different types of blood into the weakened bodies of the prisoners, as if blood compatibility was a game without consequences. His experiments, which also involved barbiturates and morphine derivatives, were nothing more than a sign of absolute disregard for human life. August Hirt is not far behind. He organized the collection of 86 skulls of prisoners to test aberrant racial theories. The idea of collecting skulls was not simple madness, but an attempt to justify genocide with pseudoscience. For Hirt, the death of these people was not enough. He needed their bodies, or what was left of them, to be part of his repulsive research. He also subjected prisoners to mustard gas tests. However, the prize for infamy goes to Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of the Nazi regime. Their victims, mostly healthy young men in the prime of their lives, became mere pieces of a macabre game of experimentation. Mengele often subjected them to X-rays with the intention of sterilizing them. He didn't care that their once healthy bodies withered under radiation burns that turned into festering sores. But the horror did not end there. Mengele, with his morbid curiosity, took pleasure in comparing the suffering of the twins. One was subjected to such painful trials that the other could feel the echo of suffering in his own flesh, as if they shared the same fate. Not even babies and children escaped its clutches. To him, they were nothing more than anatomical dolls that could be opened, dissected, and studied without anesthesia, leaving behind a trail of tiny, shattered lives. Among his most aberrant studies was his insatiable curiosity about dwarves. Mengele saw in them a living laboratory, a genetic puzzle that, according to him, had to be solved. However, his experiments were nothing more than an excuse to inflict suffering, leaving his victims with mutilated bodies and fractured minds, trapped in the labyrinth of pain that he himself had created. Inside Block 10, there was no escape. The windows, sealed with wooden planks, did not allow light from outside to enter, or screams from within to come out. The stale air was filled with the smell of antiseptics and death, while the walls resounded with the echoes of indescribable suffering. Outside the block, gunfire and screams from the nearby Wall of Death could be heard in the distance, but they seemed to come from another world. Inside, time stopped, and suffering became the only tangible reality. In May 1944, Klauberg moved his experimental station to what was known as the Field Extension. It was not an improvement for the women prisoners, just a change of scenery to continue with the same atrocities. Many of them died from the experiments, others were killed after doctors finished with them, their bodies treated as mere waste to be disposed of to make room for the next victims. However, in the midst of all this, there were those who survived. They survived the pain, the terror, the despair. One of them was Leni Adelar, whose testimony reminds us that despite everything, life can flourish in the most inhospitable places. Against all odds, some of these women who had been treated as less than human managed to have children. But the fact that some survived cannot erase the unspeakable suffering that was experienced there. Auschwitz's Block 10 is an open wound in history. The doctors who should have saved lives became instruments of death and pain, and the women who were brought to that place suffered not only the loss of their freedom, but also that of their dignity and their bodies. Silent suffering, the dark secrets of Block 11. Block 11 stands as a monument to suffering. The facade, barely distinguishable from the rest of the buildings, hides the horrors that were brewing inside. Here in this block, death was not a fortuitous event, but a constant that permeated every corner. The prisoners who walked through its doors knew that if they did not perish, they would perish in their souls, because it was not just a place of confinement, it was a place of moral annihilation. From day one, prisoners felt the weight of oppressive silence. The SS guards, unperturbed, moved like shadows, preparing the cells for the new arrivals. The basement, dark and damp, housed the punishment cells, those traps where despair seeped through the walls, where time stood still and the body began to deteriorate long before the mind realized its doom. The standing cells were small, barely a square meter, a minimal space in which 4 bodies were forced to stand upright without rest, without relief. The air became heavy, and the heat of the human body, far from providing comfort, became a curse. In those cells, breathing was an effort, oxygen a scarce commodity. As if that were not enough, sleep was a luxury that was only reached when the conscience gave in to excessive exhaustion. Even then, the rest was brief. The body would weaken, and the mind would drown in thoughts of despair. Those who survived this martyrdom were led, sooner or later, to the wall of death. This wall, located right next to the block, witnessed countless executions. The prisoners, lined up in front of him, knew that their lives were about to be taken away for mere existence under a regime that considered them inferior, unworthy to breathe the same air as their executioners. Within the block, torture was the daily bread. The infamous Boger's hammock, an ingenious torture device invented by Officer Wilhelm Boger, became the terror of those who dared to challenge, even with a sigh, the authority of their captors. Placed face down, hanging by their ankles, the prisoners were viciously beaten. The screams that came from their throats, a guttural, inhuman sound, which could only come from a creature on the verge of suffering, filled the dark corridors. Sometimes these screams were the only sign of life in a place where death was always present, lurking, waiting its turn. Block 11 was also the site of the first experiments with Zyklon B. In September 1941, Soviet prisoners of war were led into the block's basement and exposed to the gas. Silence gripped the room when the doors were shut, a silence only broken when bodies began to collapse to the floor one after another in a macabre fall of life. This experiment marked the beginning of an even darker era, where death would no longer be individual but collective, a mass death that would define the following years. The prisoners, reduced to numbers, watched as their companions fell one by one. The inscriptions they left on the walls of their cells, words etched in desperation, were their final attempt to cling to the humanity that was being stripped from them. Some left messages of love, others of hatred, but all shared a common sentiment, the certainty that they would not leave that place alive. Every wall, every brick, was imbued with the pain of those who suffered and perished there. The windows of the block, covered with metal sheets, blocked out any ray of sunlight, as if light itself refused to enter such a corrupted place. Prisoners were brought there to be broken, to be stripped of their dignity, their will, their humanity. The few who survived the punishment cells did so with shattered bodies and broken spirits, shadows of what they once were. Those selected for the gas experiments had no idea what awaited them. They were led to the basement with the promise of a bath or disinfection, but instead of water, what awaited them was invisible agony, a gas that seeped into their lungs and extinguished their lives in the cruelest, most merciless way. The guards watched through the peepholes, indifferent to the suffering they had caused, as if the twisted bodies and distorted faces were mere objects of study, not human beings. The death wall, where thousands of prisoners were executed, still stands as a silent witness. Its stones, cold and rough, have absorbed the echo of gunshots, the screams of terror, and the pleas for mercy. The journey of no return, the railroads to the Holocaust. On a grey and silent morning in the early 1942, the iron rails that ran through the small Polish town of Oświęcim began to vibrate with unusual frequency. Locals, accustomed to the monotonous sound of freight trains, noticed something different in the air. The black smoke rising on the horizon seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if it brought with it a harbinger of the darkness to come. Oświęcim, with its network of railways connecting cities such as Prague, Vienna, Berlin, and Warsaw, quickly became the beating heart of a meticulously planned machinery of death. The Nazis, always efficient in their cruelty, saw in this railway junction the perfect opportunity to carry out their so-called final solution with terrifying precision. The first convoys arrived full of hope mixed with fear. Men, women, and children squeezed into freight cars designed to carry goods, not people. With no windows, no ventilation, no water or food, these wagons became mobile graves for many. The stench of despair and death permeated the air inside those compartments, while the constant rattle of wheels on the rails marked the rhythm of a journey of no return. The guards of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, with vacant stares and hardened hearts, supervised these transports with chilling indifference. To them, these human beings were nothing more than numbers in a report, interchangeable pieces in a macabre game of power and destruction. The roads that had once served to connect peoples and cultures now served to isolate, dehumanize, and exterminate. When we arrived at the so-called Judenrampe, reality struck with indescribable force. The doors of the carriages burst open and a wave of exhausted and confused bodies was pushed into the cold reality of Auschwitz. The gravel floor, the watchtowers, and the omnipresent smell of burnt flesh made up a Dantesque picture that no imagination could have conceived. The selection process began immediately. SS officers in impeccable uniforms and steely looks signaled with a simple wave of hands who would live a few more weeks and who would be sent straight to the gas chambers. Families were separated in a matter of seconds, with muffled screams and silent tears falling on the dust. Those who were deemed fit for work were herded into barracks, where survival was a daily battle against hunger, cold, and constant brutality. But for most, the path from the ramp to the gas chambers was short and definitive. Under the false promise of disinfectant showers, hundreds of thousands met their end in hermetically sealed rooms where Zyklon B extinguished lives in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, the trains kept coming, one after another, like an endless procession of horror. From all corners of occupied Europe, convoys brought new victims to this epicenter of human barbarism. Hungarians, Poles, French, Dutch, the list was endless, and the efficiency with which the extermination was carried out was almost surreal. The train drivers and railway personnel, essential cogs in this machine of death, carried out their duties with administrative coldness. They pleaded ignorance or simply obeyed orders, but every train whistle, every screeching brake contributed to the symphony of genocide. The tracks, silent and mute, bore the weight not only of the trains, but also of the crushed hopes and dreams of millions. In May 1944, the Nazis, always seeking to perfect their deadly efficiency, built a new railway line that led directly into Auschwitz-Birkenau. This logistical innovation allowed trains to reach the very doors of the gas chambers, reducing the time and effort required to get victims to their final destination. During this period, the speed and volume of extermination reached unprecedented levels, with thousands of Hungarian Jews being killed daily in a perfectly timed choreography of death. The few who managed to survive this hell did so at the cost of their humanity. Working to exhaustion, fed miserable rations, and subjected to inhumane medical experiments, each day was a struggle to maintain a spark of hope. The smoke from the crematoria was constantly rising to the sky, as a sign that evil knows no bounds or rest. With the advance of the Allied forces and the imminent German defeat, the Nazis tried to erase the traces of their crimes. Crematoria were demolished, documents burned, and prisoners forced on death marches into Germany. But the railroad tracks, silent witnesses to so much atrocity, remained like scars on the landscape, indelible reminders of how far human cruelty can go. After the liberation of the camp, silence reigned again in Auschwitz. The trains stopped bringing human cargo, and the tracks were rusted and abandoned, like skeletons of an era that should never be erased from the collective memory. The place that was once synonymous with death and despair became a museum and memorial, an effort to honor the victims and educate future generations about the horrors that occurred there. Today, the rails remain still, covered by grass and moss, but their story resonates strongly. Every plank of wood, every rusty nail tells a story of pain, loss, and resilience. Visitors walk along these roads with respect and solemnity, trying to understand the incomprehensible, to find meaning in the senseless. The old Auschwitz tracks no longer carry trains laden with death, but they are still a path to reflection and remembrance. The Rebellion of Courage: How a Midwife Faced Death in Auschwitz. Stanisława Leszczyńska was born in 1896 in the Polish city of Łódź, in a world that had not yet known the devastation that the first half of the 20th century would bring. Her life seemed destined for normality, a simple existence with her husband Bronisław, whom she married in 1916, and with whom she would have 4 children. Determined to help bring new lives into the world, Stanisława trained as a midwife, earning her degree in 1922 and settling into her professional field with dedication and tenderness in her hometown. The tranquility of those early years would be shattered by the inexorable advance of Nazism. With the German occupation of Poland, Stanisława and his family decided not to sit idly by in the face of the horror that loomed over their Jewish neighbors. Quietly, but determinedly, they engaged in the resistance, helping those confined in the Łódź ghetto with forged food and documents. The risk was immense, but humanitarian duty outweighed any fear. On February 18, 1943, the Gestapo burst into Stanisława's life, snatching his freedom for his acts of compassion. Together with her daughter Sylvia, she was captured and taken to Auschwitz. Her husband and eldest son managed to escape, but her 2 youngest children were sent to a labor camp. Stanisława's fate was now tied to the hell of Auschwitz, a place where human life was worth no more than the whim of the Nazi guards. They arrived at the field on April 17, 1943, and were marked with the numbers 41,335 and 41,336, respectively. At Auschwitz, Stanisława was assigned to the women's infirmary, a place of suffering where the laws of nature and medicine were constantly subverted by the cruelty of men. In the midst of death and despair, Stanisława became a dim but persistent light. As a midwife, her job was to ensure that babies were born, although the very idea of giving life in a place like Auschwitz was absurd. Dr. Josef Mengele, with his clinical coldness and obsession with racial purity, ran this corner of the camp. Under his gaze, newborn children were more objects of study than human beings. Babies who did not meet racial standards were unceremoniously eliminated. Those who had the misfortune of being born with Aryan features were snatched from their mothers to be Germanized. In total, Stanisława helped deliver more than 3,000 babies in conditions that defied any concept of humanity. Although all of these creatures were born alive, the fate that awaited them was grim. Approximately 2,500 perished because of malnutrition and the terrible conditions of the camp. 600 children with blonde hair and blue eyes were torn from their mothers and sent to Germany, where they would be raised as Germans. Only 30 managed to survive the horror of Auschwitz with their mothers. In the dark nights of Auschwitz, the small infirmary became a makeshift sanctuary where mothers, if only for an instant, could cling to the hope of a different future. Stanisława didn't just deliver babies, it also delivered the spark of humanity in a world that was trying to extinguish it. Despite constant threats, Stanisława refused to participate in the inhumane acts ordered of him. When Mengele suggested that she drown unwanted newborns, she steadfastly refused. "No, not now or ever. A midwife is not here to kill." These words, simple and full of dignity, resounded like an echo of what should have been a sacred oath, although at Auschwitz they seemed an act of madness. Interestingly, Mengele did not murder Leszczyńska for her daring. He limited himself to requesting periodic reports on cases of puerperal fever and death in childbirth. Time in Auschwitz passed slowly and agonizingly, an eternity encapsulated in days that seemed to never end. Stanisława's routine did not change. Endless nights of childbirth, days full of uncertainty and fear. But despite the abyss of hopelessness that surrounded her, she never failed to do her duty. She was aware that any mistake, any sign of weakness, could mean death, not only for herself, but for those she had sworn to protect. With the advent of liberation on January 26, 1945, Auschwitz, that symbol of absolute evil, became an empty skeleton, a monument to the atrocities committed in the name of a twisted ideology. Stanisława, weakened but indomitable, returned to Łódź, carrying with her not only the memories of the horrors she had witnessed, but also the certainty that she had done her duty. After the war, life for Stanisława was never the same again. She resumed her work as a midwife, but the trauma and shadow of Auschwitz were always present. However, his dedication to saving innocent lives at Auschwitz did not go unnoticed. In the dreary winter of 1970, a silent crowd gathered in Warsaw to remember the horror that had been that concentration camp. Among those present, Stanisława Leszczyńska, the woman who had defied the devil himself by bringing life in the midst of death, was reunited with those she had helped to be born in hell. His eyes, which had seen the unimaginable, reflected a mixture of pain and inexplicable strength. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was an encounter with memory, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life clings to hope tooth and nail. In his honor, the avenue leading to the entrance of the former concentration camp now bears his name. Several hospitals were renamed after her and are temples where life is celebrated, ironically connected to a horror story, as if the past was trying to redeem itself, albeit unsuccessfully. The Catholic Church, in her eternal search for redemption, has proclaimed her Servant of God, a title that seems little for a woman who faced absolute evil, and his tomb, a place of pilgrimage, welcomes those who seek a trace of faith in the midst of despair. The Auschwitz Puff, sexual slavery at the heart of the Holocaust. In 1943, in the heart of Auschwitz, a place was erected that under any other circumstance would have been simply grotesque. Here, however, it was much more than that. It was a declaration of absolute perversity, a macabre display of the systematic dehumanization that the Nazis had elevated to a sadistic art. This place, disguised under the harmless name of Puff, was nothing more than a brothel created in Block 24 of the main camp, one more tool in the box of horrors of Hitler's regime. The Puff wasn't for everyone. This privilege was reserved only for those whom the Nazis considered worthy, those who complied with the labor demands imposed by their jailers. Jews and Soviet prisoners of war, considered inferior in the twisted Nazi racial hierarchy, were excluded from this place, a stark reminder of the racial ideology that permeated every aspect of life and death in the concentration camps. The beneficiaries of the Puff were, for the most part, those prisoners who, in order to survive, had become the instruments of the Nazi will, maintaining order and discipline among the other inmates. The women who worked at the Puff didn't get there by choice. They were victims of a brutal form of sexual slavery, dragged from other camps by their past, often because of prostitution, other times simply because the Nazis considered them undesirable in society. They were nothing more than pieces in a macabre game, selected to satisfy the wishes of the favored prisoners. The Puff was a place where a woman's body became a bargaining chip in Auschwitz's ailing economy. In that depraved space, every day of work was torture. From Monday to Friday, each of these women was to serve 4 or 5 men, each with a 20-minute window to consummate the act. It was 20 minutes for horror, repeated over and over again, night after night. In exchange for this endless degradation, they were offered upgrades, a little more food, medical care, and a relatively clean place to sleep. Compared to the rest of Auschwitz, these conditions might seem like a luxury, but in reality they were a mockery of human dignity. In all, about 20 women were working on the Puff at any given time, with a steady stream of replacements. The Nazis made sure that these women, who had already been stripped of everything that made them human, remained useful until their last breath. The exploitation was total, with no room for rest, no room for mental or physical escape. Under the watchful eye of SS guards, these women were forced to participate in a cycle of sexual violence, that left indelible marks on their bodies and souls. Every night, as the prisoners arrived, well-fed and with their faces hardened by the daily routine of death that ruled Auschwitz, the women knew that their suffering would be their only company. The Puff wasn't just a place of torture for women. It was a constant reminder of the absolute power the Nazis wielded over life and death. Every sexual act in that brothel was a transaction that reinforced the brutal hierarchy within the camp. For the men who frequented the Puff, the use of these services was not just a prize. It was a reaffirmation of their position within the camp's power structure, proof that despite being prisoners, they could still exert dominance over others, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. However, it wasn't just a place of pain for women. He also achieved suffering for the men who frequented him, although in a different way. These men, privileged prisoners of a system that used them as tools to maintain control, were also trapped in a cycle of degradation. For many, the Puff represented a degradation of their humanity, a reminder that, despite their privileges, they were still prisoners, stripped of their dignity, forced to participate in acts that perpetuated the brutality of the system that imprisoned them. The SS guards, the true masters of this hell, watched every move, making sure the Puff continued to run smoothly. But even in that absolute control, the corruption of the Nazi system was evident. To the SS officers, these women were just another resource to be exploited, and the Puff, another cog in the vast machinery of oppression and death that was Auschwitz. As time passed, the faces of the women in the Puff blurred, losing themselves in the mist of horror that enveloped the field. Their names and stories became irrelevant, consumed by the fire of the Nazi death industry. The Puff was ultimately a reflection of the utter despair that defined existence at Auschwitz. For the women who worked there was no future, just an endless succession of nights that turned into days, and days that turned into more nights, until finally their bodies broke under the pressure, and they were replaced by another. For the men who frequented it, the Puff was a constant reminder of their own despair, of meaninglessness in a world where power was measured in lives taken and bodies used. The story of the beanbag at Auschwitz is a story of unparalleled horror, a reminder of how low humanity can fall when it is denied morality, compassion, and dignity. Surviving the Holocaust, the secret tragedy of the Sonderkommando. The day they arrived, they were told that they would have a special task, a job that would assure them, even if only momentarily, a respite from the death they breathed in every corner of that hell. They were strong young men, and the Nazis needed steady hands to hold the noose of their macabre plan. Thus were born the Sonderkommando, a group of Jewish prisoners whose destiny was to manipulate death with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. The life of a Sonderkommando was a cruel paradox. They were selected for their vigor, their ability to endure work that no human being should ever face. They were given a slightly better ration of food, a slightly less dirty mattress, but the real pay was the horror they had to perpetrate on a daily basis. They were the witnesses and executioners of their own race, a distorted reflection of the kind of victim they were, and the monster that Nazism intended them to be. When the doors of the gas chambers closed with a roar that resounded in their souls, they would stand outside waiting. They knew what was happening inside. Men, women, children, all inhaling the Zyklon B that killed them in minutes. The screams, the desperate scratches on the walls, everything was hidden behind those thick walls, but for them, the screams kept echoing in their minds, trapped, unable to escape. Minutes later, it was their turn to enter. The doors opened, and what greeted them was a Dantesque spectacle. Intertwined bodies, eyes open in a last look of terror, broken and bloody nails from trying to escape the inescapable. To his misfortune, there was no time for feelings. They had to act quickly, remove the bodies, take them to the ovens or the pits, pull out gold teeth, cut the hair. Everything was done with the same cold and calculated mechanics that the Nazis had perfected in their death machines. Hands that would otherwise have caressed a child now moved with the dexterity acquired by repetition, pulling out the teeth of the dead, pushing wheelbarrows of bodies into the furnaces. They, who in the past had been doctors, teachers, bakers, artisans, were now cogs in an infernal machinery that consumed them little by little. The Nazis, masters of depravity, understood that these men could not survive long with that knowledge. There could be no witnesses to what happened in those chambers, let alone those who could tell the world about the horrors of the Holocaust. So, from time to time, the Sonderkommando also had to die. They were rotated, exterminated, and replaced by new ones. The cycle repeated itself over and over again, a cycle of death in which the life of a Sonderkommando was worth no more than that of any other prisoner. They knew that they were next in line, that the same bodies they dragged into the fire would one day accompany them on the pyre. But in the meantime, they worked. 16 fought for every second of life, even if that second was wrapped in the stench of death. There were times when some tried to resist, even though they knew their efforts were futile. October 1944 was a month that marked despair on the faces of those who had nothing left to lose, resulting in a failed rebellion. Some of the Sonderkommando, those who survived until the end of the war, carried with them the weight of guilt and misunderstanding. They were seen by other survivors as collaborators, traitors who had aided the Nazis in their genocide. No one understood the moral dilemma they faced, the constant terror that pushed them to continue living one more day, even if that day was stained with blood and death. But they knew that their testimonies were crucial, that the world must know the truth. Philip Müller, Dario Gabay, Henrik Tauber, Morris Venezia, Zalman Gradowski, Abraham Bomba. Their names were inscribed in history not only as survivors, but as bearers of the memory of those who could not tell their story. When the Allied troops finally arrived and the death camps were liberated, the few remaining Sonderkommando were shadows of their former selves. They were no longer men, but ghosts, specters that wandered through a world they could barely recognize. Their testimonies, full of pain and suffering that no words could fully express, became the last cry of the dead. But the world was not kind to them. In the end, their roles in the camps made them pariahs, even among the survivors themselves. Humanity, in its infinite capacity to judge, could not see beyond the surface of what had been the life of a Sonderkommando. They were condemned to oblivion, their histories distorted, their suffering ignored. IG Farben, the dark alliance between corporations and Nazi crimes. Germany in the 1930s began to weave a mantle that would expand throughout the European continent. At the heart of this grim process, large German corporations merged, creating industrial colossi that, far from being limited to the production of goods and services, became vital cogs in the Nazi machine. Among these giants, IG Farben, an amalgam of chemical and pharmaceutical companies, stood out for its size, power, and for the abject role it would play in the crimes of the Third Reich. In this conglomerate, Bayer, one of the most recognizable names in the pharmaceutical industry, played a crucial and grotesque role, sealing its legacy with the blood of countless innocents. The year 1936, under the growing shadow of the Nazi regime, witnessed how IG Farben began to collaborate closely with the SS on projects that today would chill the blood of anyone with a modicum of conscience. The conglomerate not only provided the Wehrmacht with the chemicals needed for war, but also immersed itself in medical experiments that broke every ethical barrier imaginable. In the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Gusen, Bayer's laboratories became dens of horror, where science was perverted to serve cruelty and the most extreme sadism. Under the direction of SS physician Helmut Wetter, Bayer began conducting medical experiments. In Birkenau, a section of Auschwitz, women and men prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases such as tuberculosis and diphtheria. These human beings, reduced to mere numbers and living experiments, were subjected to drug tests that, for the most part, only hastened their death in the midst of unspeakable suffering. Wetter, driven by greed and unscruples, documented each death as one more step toward a goal that only he and his superiors understood or wanted to understand. But death, in this context, was not an accident or a side effect, but the expected and, in some way, desired outcome. However, the most macabre thing about these experiments lies not only in their conduct, but in Bayer's reaction to the results. In one particularly horrendous episode, the company paid for 150 female prisoners to test a new anesthetic. All of them died, without exception. Bayer's response was not to stop the experiments or reflect on the morality of their actions, but to request another group of women from the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, because the results of the first test were inconclusive. In parallel to these experiments, Bayer also benefited from the use of slave labor in its factories. In 1943, nearly half of 18 IG Farben workers were slaves or forced laborers, including some 30,000 Auschwitz prisoners. These men and women, already stripped of their humanity, were exploited to exhaustion in the production of synthetic rubber and other materials essential to the Nazi war machine. Bayer, as an integral part of IG Farben, not only knew about these conditions, but promoted them, seeing in each prisoner not a person, but just another tool in its vast industrial complex. As the war progressed and German defeat loomed on the horizon, executives at IG Farben and Bayer began to take desperate measures to conceal their complicity in these crimes. In January 1945, as the Red Army approached Auschwitz, orders were given to destroy records documenting the atrocities committed at the complex. In Frankfurt, in the spring of 1945, 15 tons of documents were incinerated and shredded in an attempt to erase the traces of their involvement in one of the darkest chapters in human history. Despite these efforts, the truth came out, and after the war, the Allies took action against IG Farben and its executives. During the Nuremberg trials, several senior officials of Bayer and other companies of the conglomerate were tried for war crimes. Fritz Termeer, one of the main architects of Auschwitz III, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his role in planning and executing the atrocities at Monowitz. However, justice was short-lived. In 1950, Termeer was released for good behavior and insidiously resumed a position of power at Bayer, being elected chairman of the supervisory board in 1956, a position he held until 1964. Despite its complicity in crimes against humanity, Bayer re-emerged as one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies during Germany's post-war economic miracle. Its executives, many of whom were directly responsible for the atrocities, were reintegrated into society, and the company continued to thrive, almost as if the war years had been erased from its corporate memory. This renaissance was not without controversy. In 1995, Bayer's then CEO, Helge Wehmeyer, offered a public apology to Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. But, as many have pointed out, an apology cannot undo the past, nor can it redeem those who benefited from the suffering and death of millions. A Spy in Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki's suicide mission. Witold Pilecki was born on May 13, 1911 in Olonets, Karelia, a region under the rule of the Russian Empire at the time. His family had been forced to move to this remote region following the violent repression by the Tsarist authorities against the Polish insurrection of January 1863. In 1910, the Pilecki family moved to Wilno, today known as Vilnius in Lithuania, where Witold began to forge his combative character by joining the secret scout organization ZHP. Unbeknownst to them then, this would be the beginning of a life marked by war, resistance, and betrayal. When World War I broke out, Pilecki joined Polish self-defense units in the Wilno region, participating in the collection of weapons and disarming retreating German troops. But the real test of his mettle came during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919, where he commanded a section of scouts that was overwhelmed by Bolshevik forces. Far from surrendering, Pilecki enlisted in the Polish Regular Army, fighting in the desperate retreat from Kiev in 1920. It was then that he joined the 211 Ulan Regiment and participated in the decisive Battle of Warsaw, contributing to Wilno's release. These early experiences in the war hardened Pilecki, setting the stage for the atrocities he would later witness. With the end of the war, Witold Pilecki attempted to return to a peaceful life. But peace in Europe was as illusory as it was fragile, and Pilecki would soon find himself in the eye of the storm again, this time facing a far more sinister foe. In September 1940, Witold Pilecki made a decision that few, if any, would have considered. He voluntarily surrendered to the Nazis to be interned in the newly established Auschwitz concentration camp. Under the alias Tomasz Serafiński, he was registered as prisoner number 4859. The mission Pilecki had assigned himself was both suicidal and crucial: to infiltrate the camp to gather information about conditions and organize an internal resistance. As soon as he arrived, Pilecki understood the magnitude of what was brewing in Auschwitz. What was initially designed for political prisoners soon morphed into a machinery of mass extermination, especially directed against Jews. Hunger, forced labor, and death lurked in every corner. He described hunger as the hardest battle of his life, while battling diseases such as pneumonia and typhus. But despite the inhumane conditions, Pilecki did not allow his spirit to be broken. Quickly, he began recruiting other prisoners, forming a secret resistance organization within hell itself. The Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, better known as the ZOW. The ZOW was not only responsible for improving the living conditions of the prisoners, but also set out to organize a potential insurrection. Pilecki, using a messaging system operated by the Polish resistance throughout occupied Europe, managed to send detailed reports on the atrocities committed at Auschwitz to the Polish government in exile in London as early as 1941. These reports included graphic descriptions of inhumane medical experiments and the existence of gas chambers, constituting some of the earliest evidence of the Holocaust. As the months passed, Pilecki and his group drew up multiple plans to liberate the camp, including one in which the RAF would bomb the walls of Auschwitz, or in which Free Polish paratroopers would be dropped from Britain. But the support of the Allies never materialized, and in 1943, with the growing risk of being transferred to another camp, Pilecki made the decision to escape. Together with 2 other prisoners, he made a daring escape, bypassing the camp's defenses and traveling nearly 100 kilometers to safety. But his fight against evil was not yet over. After his escape, Witold Pilecki did not find the rest that many would have wanted. He continued to fight the Nazis, joining the resistance in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. He was captured by the Germans and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. But while the world conflict had died down, Pilecki was about to face an even closer and more treacherous enemy. After the end of World War II, Pilecki was sent to Italy, where he joined the Free Polish troops in July 1945. But his homeland was being devoured from within by Soviet clutches, and Pilecki decided to return to Poland to spy on the communist occupation. He was loyal to the end to the Polish government in exile in London, rejecting any form of collaboration with the Moscow-backed communist regime. His loyalty and courage, however, would not save him from the final betrayal. In 1947, Pilecki was captured by the Polish communist regime. What followed was a series of tortures that sought not only to break her body, but also her spirit. But Pilecki, faithful to his cause to the end, refused to reveal sensitive information about his comrades in the resistance. Finally, in 1948, he was subjected to a sham trial, one of those orchestrated to instill fear and eliminate any hint of opposition. He was not allowed to testify or present a defense. His fate was already sealed from the beginning. He was sentenced to death. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed with a shot to the back of the head. His body was never officially identified, and his burial place remains unknown to this day. All against hell, the rebellion that resounded in Auschwitz. In the early morning of October 7, 1944, a sepulchral silence enveloped the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. The long shadows of the barbed wire were cast on the muddy ground, a mute testimony to the suffering that was experienced in that place. Yet in the bowels of the camp, a group of men were planning an act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to wrest a few hours of dignity from fate. They were the Sonderkommando. They knew their fate was sealed. The Nazis could not afford to leave living witnesses to their atrocities, and the cycle of extermination was repeated over and over again, with new groups of Sonderkommando replacing the previous ones, who were mercilessly executed. The rumors had spread. They had heard about the imminent liquidation of many of them, and desperation began to transform into determination. For months, a silent resistance had been brewing in the shadows. A group of young women, brave beyond words, had been stealing small quantities of gunpowder from a nearby munitions factory, the Weichsel Union Metalwerke. With ingenuity, they hid the gunpowder in their bodies, passing it from hand to hand, from soul to soul, until it reached the men who were willing to sacrifice what little they had left, their lives. Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, Ella Gertner, and Regina Safferstein were the architects of this act of defiance. Coordinating with the leaders of the Sonderkommando, they devised a plan that, although they knew doomed to failure, would allow them to die with weapons in their hands rather than be led like lambs to the slaughterhouse. The day arrived. A thick mist crept over the field like a harbinger of blood that was about to be shed. The prisoners of Crematorium 4th, where most of the Sonderkommando were concentrated, knew that there was no turning back. With trembling but determined hands, they prepared the homemade explosives. The glances exchanged were few, the words even less. There was no time for farewells, only for action. Desperation gave them strength, rage, courage. The silence of dawn was broken by an explosion that resounded like thunder in the heart of Auschwitz. The 4th crematorium was partially destroyed, and in the ensuing chaos, 3 German guards fell dead. For an instant, freedom seemed possible, like an ephemeral dream fading into the dusty and ash-laden air. But the Nazis' response was swift and brutal. Like wounded beasts, the SS guards charged at the prisoners with inhuman fury. The battle was short-lived. What had begun as a roar ended in a whisper, as the bodies of the rebels fell to the ground, one after another. The earth of Auschwitz, already soaked with the blood of innocents, also drank that of those who had dared to raise their hands against their executioners. About 250 prisoners were killed in the fray, and another 200 were executed in the days that followed. The Nazis, fearing that the rebellion would spread, acted with even greater cruelty. The women who had provided the gunpowder were arrested, tortured, and eventually executed, but not even in death did they take away their dignity. Rosa Robota, before being hanged, uttered a cry of defiance. Be strong, be strong. The repression was not limited to individuals. The Nazis, in their eagerness to erase any trace of resistance, began to dismantle the 4th crematorium, the symbol of their shame. The smoke rising from the chimneys became less dense, but the air was still permeated with the smell of death, a smell that never left the place. With the advance of the Red Army, the Nazis knew that time was running out. Evacuations, known as the death marches, began. Thousands of prisoners were forced to walk in the brutal cold, with hardly any clothes to cover, without food or water. Those who couldn't keep up were shot down on the spot. The roads leading out of Auschwitz became rivers of bodies, a final sacrifice to feed the Nazi death machine. When the camp was finally liberated in January 1945, what was left was a desolate landscape, an open wound in the earth and in the human consciousness. The ovens had cooled, but the memory of their infernal heat lingered. The survivors, those few who managed to escape bullets, gas, and hunger, carried a story that the world did not want to hear but needed to know. In the years that followed, some of those responsible for the atrocities were brought to justice. Judgments that tried, with words and laws, to put a price on suffering. Many of the executioners escaped, like specters fading into the night, leaving no trace but fear in the hearts of their victims. Mengele, the angel of death, was one of them. The rebellion of October 7, 1944 was in many ways a futile act. It did not change the course of the war, it did not stop the genocide, but it was a spark in the darkness, a scream in the void.